Okay. Hello again, everybody. Thank. Okay. As you can hear, we're having some last-minute technical challenges with the remote speaker. But anyways, I'd like to welcome you to the final block of our session, the third block now. We're going to have 4 presentations, and then we'll have a little panel debate among some people here on the stage. It will be moderated by myself and by Cecilia von Kuhlfeld as my co-moderator. In the meantime, we're going to have another keynote talk to start off this block of presentation. And this keynote talk is going to be given by Gary Griffith. He's joining us actually live from New Zealand. So this poor guy. But he agreed to do it, so he's here now. He's going to give a talk which he entitled himself, Protect Effectively, Produce Sustainably, and Prosper Equally, Adaptive Thinking. So whenever you're ready, Gary, we're also ready here, and the digital floor is yours. Gary, if you can hear me, can you share your screen? That should get everything going on this side as well then. Yeah. So our first speaker of this session will be Gary Griffith, joining us live from New Zealand now in the middle of the night. Gary will give us a nice talk here, a keynote talk to set the tone for this last block of presentations of this adaptive management session. His talk is going to be about how to protect effectively, produce sustainably, and prosper equally, and how we can get there with adaptive thinking. Gary, so much for joining us from the other side of the world at this forbidden hour of the night. Thanks so much.
No problem.
And
yeah, great, Igor.
Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours to
Sure. So when Igor asked me to talk about this, I debated what to talk about. So what I'm going to do really is just a series of thoughts to really try and open the discussion and probably focus a little bit on my own interest area. So here we go. Okay, sorry, Igor, to do this, but can you see me there?
We can see you, but not your screen.
Oh.
Okay, now you can see your PowerPoint.
Right. Sorry, New Zealand's not that far behind, guys. Sorry. Okay.
You're supposed to be ahead of us. Come on.
I'm actually on a high country station, but I'm back helping with family stuff. So I've been out mustering all day, so I apologize. I'm a little bit tired, but here we go. So title of my talk was Protect Effectively, Produce Sustainably, and Prosper Equally, because I think that's really all our aspirations pan-Arctic. But to really get there, in particular in view of the session that Igor has here, is there are a number of issues that we have to face, and I call this the reality check. The first one is that consensus requires goodwill, and I think lately we've seen some dismantling of international consensus and goodwill, which is going to be a challenge for us, particularly as scientists moving forward, to look at some of the issues facing the Arctic. The second one is something that I've also been working on in my own research, both at the Polar Institute and at Princeton, is the disconnect between the speed of the environmental change and the speed of management, intervention, and policy change. We are seeing quite dramatic changes, obviously. I mean, just as an example, here in New Zealand recently, you will have, in the last few days, we've had massive flooding in Auckland, and it's now hitting us here where I am in the high country. So This disconnect between the speed of environmental change and the speed of management, intervention, and policy change is going to require us to have some paradigm shift to try and bridge that gap and to speed up the management decisions and policy decisions for potential intervention in what we're likely to face going from here. The other one is simply that, which we've known for obviously a long time, and for the audience is a very obvious thing, is the complexity of the interactions between the biodiversity in the Arctic, the people, the threats, and the management decisions. And the last one is something, again, that I've seen in the last couple of years, is this perception that conservation, in other words, and protection of biodiversity and fisheries promote dramatically different, irreconcilable estimates of the optimal percentage of a region to protect in reserves. And I'm seeing a paradigm shift here, which is wonderful to see that many people are realizing that there is not such a disconnect, that we can actually have some optimal percentage of an area to protect, but also be able to have sustainable management and protect our biodiversity. The other one is, again, something I've seen here being back in New Zealand. We've just had a massive heat flow on the marine protected area system here, which friends of mine are currently evaluating. And that's the protection paradox, that while we protect from one set of pressures, we are also potentially not selecting for those species that are so highly sensitive to other pressures. Or in our case here, where we have extreme climatic events that really cause a huge thermal event on a marine protected system. That's what I have in the second one here, extreme climate events and the effects on MPAs and really any management of the oceans. This one is a little bit controversial, and I know some people will see it as so, is that climate change is overwhelming the resilience capacity. And that by that I mean there are some parts of our system which we're beginning to see are not able to be resilient. And that is in terms of a traditional view of resilience, which is a return to the previous state, the existing state of the system. The other one, I've mentioned that twice, extreme climatic events. Sorry, that's the 1 in the morning event for me. And non-linear and non-analogous changes. And again, we are seeing a lot of non-linear changes, and we're also seeing some changes in the ecosystem of which we have had no analogy from historical records. So my sort of view on it is really to take what I call the complex adaptive systems perspective, which is the concept that small-scale interactions scale up from, for example, if we can scale from phytoplankton right up to policy, and that within those small-scale interactions, we can identify a core set of interactions that maintain the structure and function of each of those parts of the system. This is a very simple picture here of something from a paper I did in Nature Climate Change some time ago, in which you just break down different parts of the system to different types of interaction, and then you can see that there's some modular structure to that, and within that there's some core set of interactions between those that we can use to try and understand the system scaling up through the whole socio-ecological system to help us with understanding the potential effect of climate change and so on. So what I'd like to propose, and as a start to this keynote, is a little bit controversial, I think, and it's my personal viewpoint. It's what I call Arctic triage. The requirement now for us to identify the critical interaction to maintain structure and function scaling from ecosystem processes to policy and governance. And in order to do that, we need to identify within the complexity of the interactions of the socio-ecological system priority points of intervention. How that will play out, of course, at the moment is something I'm still very unclear about, but I'm just tossing that out to the audience for thinking about. And as part of that, and I think this is a requirement I've seen in my own work in Antarctica on marine protected areas, and also in the Arctic, that we need to look at some sort of adaptive and dynamic management of the system. So in the classic case of MPAs, we have static boundaries, and I think we have to be realistic and think that we need to be able to change and alter those boundaries. And I'm clearly, with the advent of much more sophisticated remote sensing systems and so on, the data is available for us to do so. And using that, we can, for example, investigate a system and then alter the boundaries of it, and also the policy and governance decisions based on some adaptive and dynamic management. And again, that will help, I think, on identifying the critical points of intervention. Open and transparent science and decision making. I think that's a critical part of this whole process. And I think that's something that's been done quite well in some cases and quite poorly in some cases, and some of the things I've certainly been involved in. And that really is for us as a science community to commit to complete open and transparent sharing of data and ideas. So what I'd like to propose now is that we need to, in order to achieve this, we have to look at a multi-layered holistic network approach. And this is part of the work I've been working on with Igor, where we're beginning to look at this in terms of using a Bayesian approach. And I don't want to go too much into the Bayesian approach, except to say that the idea is to work on probability and account for uncertainty. And then as you get more data, you improve your probability of your predictions and so on. So this is an idea that Uwe Jacob came up with, and I've been working on for the last couple of months. This is what it would look like. So we have our ecosystem at the lowest levels of the system down here. Then we have our ecosystem services, our food provisioning and so on. Move up to our socioeconomic. And I apologize for the dog. That's mustering dogs, guys. They've been working out all day with the sheep, so they'll stop in a minute. And then we then can add in our threats, the network of potential threats. And then ultimately at the governance and policy level, we can come up with some triage strategy. Now, the important part, which Uwe Jacob and others have been working on lately, and I have as well, is really looking at the links that flow through from the ecosystem all the way through. And this essentially becomes your potential points of intervention. So we look at the direct links that relay all the way through, and the indirect links, because I think, as many of you are aware, they're also very important things that we should be concentrating on. So this is, for example, building up from a very simple picture I showed before, of where you have some idea of the interactions within each of those levels of the net, at each level of the network, and then you then identify the indirect and direct relays through that system. So, assumptions. And my take on this is that network theory is a very powerful way for us to continue to assess and move forward with those interactions. Expert elucidation in a Bayesian approach. This is where you show, obviously, the science, and then allow experts to also be able to be involved in setting those networks and setting those interactions and assessing the importance of them. The complex adaptive behavior, which I think is obviously what we're seeing at the moment, quite a lot of non-linear type behavior coming through. Then you can base this on by starting with the basic architecture of each layer, simply what connects with what, and then build that up in terms of thinking about much more weighted type of interactions. Identify the core configurations of the interactions. And I think this is a particular thing that's coming out of the work I'm doing at the moment, is to focus on the indirect interactions, something that's often overlooked, particularly at a policy and governance level, but something we're seeing playing out as much more important with the influence of climate change and so on. And again, something I've been working on at the moment, and will be out shortly. There's a paper and review at Nature Communications. Using relay influence nodes may play an important role in this and also be a potential point of intervention. And I'd like to also toss this out, our need to redefine resilience. So I think we need to add another definition of resilience, and my take on this, well, it's not really my take, it's various people such as Simon Levin at Princeton, who's worked on this for many years, the capacity of socio-ecological system to absorb, recover, and adapt to changing conditions, not a return to previous conditions, but a resilience of the ability to cope with the changes as they occur. So, one way to progress. One possibility is to form a pan-Arctic triage group attached to PAM of experts to look at pushing this type of complex adaptive system thinking forward, identify the priority problems, use the network perspective, and then using a combination of modeling and observational data with expert elucidation, find the core configuration that represents the highest organization of each network. Now, I don't have time today to talk about this, but I'm more than delighted if people want to contact me and I can sort of explain in detail how that may play out. And then you can see some of the other ones that I've laid out there as well. And summary. So I'm advocating that we move and progress to a holistic, multi-layered approach in our thinking. It's quite a step with a lot of unknowns, particularly on the mathematics of trying to work out what those relayer nodes are and what those influencer nodes are. Prioritize the core interactions that lead to the best Arctic Commons outcome. So that comes back to my title for the talk of prosper, for all of us to prosper equally. And that we need to look at adaptive and dynamic socio-ecological decisions and move away from the very linear and static decisions which still tend to dominate policy and governance decisions. And yeah, I think you can see the others there. And the last one, I guess, an advocate, as I said, for a possible pan-Arctic triage experts group to pursue. So there you go. Thanks, Igor.
Thanks a lot, Gary. That's again mind-blowing, like always. I really appreciate your take on this. That's a lot of food for thought,
Yeah.
and I think it would be very nice if we can take it a bit further in the panel debate we're going to have in about half an hour. So if you want to take a power nap,
Right.
go ahead.
I'm going to go and silence these dogs and return to some science. So
All right.
just give me a few minutes. I'll stop this here.
Okay. Now we're going to go for some 3 more presentations before the debate, so see you then.
Okay.
So then I'm introducing our next speaker, who's going to talk about policy responses for cross-border impacts of climate change in the Arctic. So Claire Monsoni, I assume. Yeah, hi. Welcome to the stage, and the floor is yours.
All right, so hello everybody. I'm Claire Monsoni. I'm a junior researcher at the Finnish Environment Institute, and I'm going to present our ongoing paper on policy responses to cross-border impacts of climate change in the Arctic. So a few words of introduction. As we are all very aware, climate change progresses fast in the Arctic, and the impacts are likely to cross borders. And so in our paper, we look at those cross-border impacts and we analyze the coherence between the policies responding to these impacts. So by coherence, we mean that policies support one another, ensuring an efficient overall response to climate change. In terms of our framing, so we focus on the European Arctic when looking at the policies, and we in particular are looking at the policy response of the EU. And we also focus on adaptation, even though it's sometimes difficult to separate it from mitigation in the policy response. So I'm going to answer or try to answer 2 questions during this talk. And the first one is, what are the different cross-border impacts originating in the Arctic? and what policy response needs do they create in the short and medium long term. So here is an overall figure that we have been working on and are still working on that is based on a literature review of impacts of climate change in the Arctic. And we are also using a conceptual framework of cross-border impacts by Carter et al. So what we can see on this figure when we apply it to the Arctic is that we have 3 climate triggers that cause several initial impacts in the Arctic, and then those initial impacts are responsible for cascading impacts that end up crossing one or several borders and create cross-border risks in a region different than the one of initial impacts. So to answer our question, we identified 5 cross-border risks that need a policy response in terms of adaptation. So concerning the priority of the response, this is where it gets a bit complex. So if we start with risks for indigenous people livelihoods, we can see that almost all of the impacts originating in the Arctic are creating risks for their livelihoods. So we can say that in the short term, the policy response should focus on adaptation of indigenous people, in particular since all the other cross-border risks here also can have repercussions for indigenous people. Now if we look at risk of migration of population caused by sea level rise, here it's more location dependence, because if we are a region vulnerable to sea level rise, then the response needs to be more in the short term rather than the long term. But if we are not a region vulnerable to sea level rise yet, then this is more of a long-term policy response need. Finally, we have 3 remaining cross-border risks here. So risks linked to new commodities and trade, and risks linked to security that are both mostly caused by sea ice retreat and the new access to the Arctic. And on the other side, we have risks for cross-border infrastructures, such as transport and energy. And those 3 risks are interacting a lot with each other, since there is this kind of trade-off between building new infrastructure for trade and security, but then the vulnerability of those infrastructures because of permafrost thaw and other impacts. On top of that, so even though those risks are created by climate impacts, they are also enhanced by other triggers than just climate, and there's a lot of societal factors that come into play. And because of that, the policy response need is more soon rather than late. Finally, there is obviously a lot of policy domains that are interacting with each other in those cross-border risks. And so that takes us to our second question, which is how does policy coherence help to respond to the cross-border risks originating in the Arctic? So here, as I said in the introduction, we focus on the EU policy response. And so the main policy that responds to the cross-border risks originating in the Arctic is the EU Arctic policy. But we also have a lot of other EU policies from all the policy domains that are involved in the risks that are also having an influence on those risks. And so first we can look at horizontal coherence, meaning that we look at whether the objectives of those strategies and the objectives of the EU Arctic policy are synergetic or not having kind of conflicts between each other to make sure that we are answering the risks in an efficient way. We can also look at vertical coherence, so that is with other policy levels, so either higher policy levels, so the international policies, but for the EU it's also very relevant to look at the national member state level, since there's a lot of interaction obviously between EU and member states also might have a more influence on the Arctic itself. Finally, we can look at cross-border coherence, so that is between the EU and the climate and Arctic policies of the Arctic region, and that can be more relevant if we look not just at the EU but all the other stakeholders that are also having an influence in the Arctic. So to conclude on my presentation in a very general way and where we are at in terms of our conclusion in this ongoing paper, the Arctic is an example of where local changes have global impacts and therefore need a wide policy response to achieve adaptation. So when looking at policy coherence, we can see that it's very important, and its strengthening really requires that all policy domains increase their awareness of the potential cross-border impacts. Then we also have indigenous communities that obviously are very important in the Arctic, as I hope I showed in the risks. And for them, borders are a completely different concept, and so their involvement in the policies for adaptation is fundamental. And finally, policy coherence cannot solve the issue of who has power, of who has influence in the Arctic, and so this will be a challenge for all policies attempting to address cross-border impacts of climate change. And so that was all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really nice. I think we even have time for one question, if someone in the audience wants to go for it. If not, then we will just make sure that we can use our time wisely. And then we thank you. Thank you so much. And then we go for our next speaker, which is Jean Holloway. So she will give us, now I lost my, I need to introduce you, just a sec. I'm losing my notes here. Here we go. So Jean will give us a presentation on risk and adaptation to climate change. And you traveled all the way over from Canada, so thank you for that. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jean Holloway, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Ottawa in Canada. So yes, I had a long journey yesterday, but I'm very happy to be here. And today I'm going to be talking about today I'm going to be talking about assessing risk and adaptation to climate change. And in particular, I'll talk about the residual risk and adaptation database that my colleagues developed as part of their work as lead authors on the latest IPCC AR6. So, RRAD, the Residual Risk and Adaptation Database, is a systematic and traceable approach that supports assessment efforts across multiple key areas. So it was developed as part of the Working Group 2. They developed RRAD to standardize regional and sector-based climate assessment. And it was utilized for 2 chapters in the AR6, Chapter 14 on North America and the cross-chapter paper number 6 for the polar regions. And so we're now iterating and refining the approach. And a new version of the RRAD will be available, hopefully, in time for authors to utilize for the upcoming AR7. So I'm going to give a brief overview of risk. So risk is the potential for adverse consequences where something of value is at stake and where the occurrence and degree of an outcome is uncertain. And so risk is a function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So the hazard and the likelihood of its occurrence, and in our case, the hazard will be climate related. Vulnerability of the affected system to that hazard and the exposure to the hazard over time. And residual risks remain after mitigation and adaptation efforts have reduced the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So adaptation measures, hopefully with large impacts, so big reductions in the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, but hopefully at low cost, so either financially or without other sort of accidental repercussions, and hopefully with co-benefits for mitigation. And ideally, they'll contribute to climate resilient development pathways. And so this area in the middle, the sort of white space there, becomes the solution space for mitigation and climate resilient development. And then there are also hard limits to adaptation, right? We can only adapt so much. And so there will always be some of these residual risks, and it just depends how large they'll be. So identifying risk and residual risk has always been key for the IPCC. And there have been advances in recent years to assess key risk and representative key risks and to generate these burning ember figures, which you can see here. But currently there's no standard approach among authors or across chapters or across assessment reports through time. And so it's difficult to understand the relative risks among key sectors and regions and how they change over time if there's no standard. So we created RRAD to facilitate a systematic assessment of literature, to enable traceability and efficient generation of supplementary materials, to facilitate effective generation of tables and figures, to connect sustainable development goals to risk evaluations, to facilitate the identification of key risks within chapters and cross-chapter papers, to support synergy among sections within chapters and cross-chapter papers, so to have clean storylines throughout assessment reports, to streamline efforts to feed into synthesis chapters, and to support the identification of papers and support for burning ember figure generation. So currently, the RRAD is in a Google Sheet format. And so users input information from literature, information on things like the sector, the region, the key risks, the climate scenario that was involved in the study, and the hazard or the climate impact driver, the vulnerability and the exposure, and whether or not sustainable development goals were involved. So based on the information that's input into the database by users and linked to lookup tables, the risk and residual risk are calculated and the summary figures are generated automatically, including petal plots and burning ember diagrams, which are typical of the IPCC reports. So we aim to have an R-Shiny dynamic input and plotting tool. So that's currently under construction now, and eventually that will be the interface we'll use. So right now the Google Sheet comes with an instruction tab that you can see an example of there. There's a section for citation and metadata. And then there's a section for information about the study region, the key risks, and the climate scenarios. And the key risks are, that's a term used by the IPCC, but basically they're just the most potentially severe risks. So they get pulled out as key risks. And all of these things are linked to lookup tables within the database. So there's another section for the hazard or the climate impact driver. And these all have drop-down lists so that there's options to choose from. And they're also linked to those lookup tables. So here there's target sectors and then the direction of the effect, either positive or negative, and the magnitude, and they're all drop-down tables. There's also an option to choose the attribution and confidence levels, so from low agreement with limited evidence to high agreement with robust evidence. And then the user assigns values from none to high for the vulnerability and exposure. So that's based on the expert opinion of the user. And then the level of risk is calculated based on a linear relationship between the hazard, the vulnerability, and exposure. For adaptation, there's a section to input the modifiers and the mitigation co-benefits that are being used. And so types of adaptation include institutional, which is implemented by institutions or organizations or governments. Behavioral, which mostly is related to individual methods to adapt and cope to climate change. Regulatory, which are top-down measures, and technological, which are innovations to reduce risk and adapt. So adaptation may also unintentionally increase risk, as I mentioned. And so this is allowed here in the database with negative scores. And then the residual risk is calculated based on the risk score plus the adaptation score. So it pulls it out automatically. We've also tried our best so far to link the Sustainable Development Goals. So right now it's just a yes or no whether or not they were involved in the study that's being assessed, but we hope to more quantitatively assess this, and so we're working on developing that and putting it into the database. So this is an example of those summary figures that are output. This is just mock data. This isn't, so don't pay attention too much to what they're saying, but this is just an example of the petal plots that can be output automatically. So the petal is the amount of total risk, and then the colored area is the residual risk that's left over. I don't know if you can see it at this scale, but there's a little gray bar at the outside of the petals, and that's when you add those two things together, that's the total risk. Just very quickly, this is what the R Shiny tool will look like when it's developed. That'll be the interface ideally. And so it'll automatically create this database of all the references that are input and output those figures. So I'll just quickly summarize the future work with this. Basically, we want to make these things available for public use. We're working on an R code to generate those residual risk plots automatically. We're going to create a demo of the Shiny tool and eventually have the Shiny tool available for everyone online. Develop a GitHub repo and documentation for everything, the figures and the analysis, and publishing methods papers and about the approach. So that's it. If anyone has questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. That's impressive and really important work you guys are doing here. It's amazing if you look at the last slide, all the work you have to do to basically put it all out for all of us to use, and yeah, amazing work. So we have a little bit of time for a question if someone can come up with a question about this. Yeah, this. We need a microphone, sorry, for the audience online.
Thank you for your wonderful talk here, and I agree that will be an amazing tool that you have here. So, and I also see that you already put a lot of information inside the drop-down menu. You can click on links, you can get information up and all. So how much is that related to your area in Canada or where it is? Or is it a more, where is the balance between the global use and the very local one?
Yes, very good question. So this is based off of, as I mentioned, the work on the IPCC AR6 chapters for North America and the polar regions. So it's not Canada specific, but so far it was primarily used for those two chapters. So I guess it would be specific to those areas, but the goal is to have it be sort of global scope. So we're hoping to get feedback on all of this to help make it more relevant for global use. But yeah, it's pretty general. So I hope that we've already sort of achieved that as best we can. So.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So. Then we go on for our final, but for sure not last but not least, would like to introduce Melanie Lancaster to the stage from the WWF Global Arctic Program, with a very daunting title of a talk, but very interesting.
Okay, thank you everyone. Yes, it's a bit of a daunting task that we've embarked on, and you can see here that we have a large project team. So I'll do my best to do the project and the team justice in the next few minutes. Okay, we've heard it already, we'll hear it again. The Arctic is at the forefront of climate change. So we are here. Some time ago in the region, we've already reached 1.5 degrees of heating. So we're at a code red. And we know that changes in temperatures, sea ice, permafrost and other climate variables will continue to drive shifts in habitats and biomes, and changes in ranges and abundance of species. We know that a lack of anticipatory planning increases climate risk for nature and people, and yet there are a few strategies and initiatives that actually outline a way forward to proactively manage Arctic ecosystems and species. So this is where our project came in. We named our project Arctic Conservation Forecast, and what we were doing was to see if we could actually develop a science-based approach to help unlock the conservation paralysis that is faced by decision makers, knowing that change is happening and more change will come, but having uncertainty over the specifics. So how will things change? Where will they change? When will they change? And conversely, where will things stay the same and for how long? Okay, so a few things about the project. I can't stress it enough. It was very exploratory and very organic. We know that we have climate models that project into the future, and we also know that we have a good body of scientific knowledge on how Arctic ecosystems and species relate to those climate and environmental variables. So we wanted to ask whether we could actually use these two bodies of information and expertise to vision plausible Arctic ecological futures. And today I'm mostly going to focus on the how, because we haven't quite got to visioning those futures yet. It's been a long process. So to do this, we actually gathered a multidisciplinary team of experts from climate, oceanography, landscape modelling, ecology, communities, and also conservation planners. And we started this project in 2020. So actually all of our dialogue and the whole project essentially has been a virtual experience. So the three main phases of the project are down there, the three boxes down the middle, and the spiral is there really to illustrate the iterative nature of the project. So we spent a lot of time as a project team within each of the phases. We moved up and down the phases, and we found that that was actually necessary. And I did mention the word organic, and it really was, even though it looks very, very organised now. We found that that was necessary to allow time for discussions and testing, adapting, reaching conclusions and consensus, so that we could make progress on the project. So we settled on two timeframes for the project: mid-century, so 2050, and 2100, and they were the two time steps that we wanted to do this visioning. And then we also focused on two climate scenarios, so one representing low greenhouse gas emissions, so SSP 1 to 1.9, and one representing high greenhouse gas emissions, so SSP 5 to 8.5. And this is not trivial. That low emission scenario was actually what would represent least change of Arctic ecosystems, and that high emissions scenario would be used to represent most change. On the right, we've got just a number of steps. We had a number of activities within each of the phases, but a lot of our time, right from the beginning, right until now almost, was looking at identifying those environmental variables from CMIP6 models that could relate to ecosystem processes and species and help to vision what the future might look like for the Arctic. And I forgot to mention, but both terrestrial and marine realms. So things like surface air temperature, precipitation, sea surface temperature, bottom ocean temperatures, sea ice concentration. What do we know about these? How can we use them? What spatial scales? Okay, so a major insight, which is an obvious one, but that was quickly realised and voiced by our experts, is that Arctic ecological futures are inherently difficult to anticipate. Biological processes are complex, they're interrelated with one another in ways that we don't fully understand, and they're interrelated and affected by physical, hydrological and geological processes. On top of that, and we've heard a lot about this already today, how processes and species respond to change is often non-linear, more often than not, and sometimes we don't even know what the response curve shape is, and they can be cascading too. So, and ecological surprises make responses really difficult to get to those points to say, okay, well, we know a little bit here, but we don't know how this will affect everything to the point of 2050 and to the point of 2100. Our second insight was that we spend a lot of time, as I mentioned, linking these environmental variables to ecological processes. So we spend a lot of time asking, what do we know about the relationship between For example, how do we know surface air temperature relates to vegetation growth in Arctic terrestrial systems? How does sea ice concentration relate to primary productivity in marine ecosystems? And then on top of that, do we have adequate confidence in what the CMIP6 model output tells us for each of those climate variables? And if we don't, then what do we do and what can we say? And then on top of that, at which scale should we be applying these relationships to have a look at the model output? So for example, July mean temperature is actually a really important month to be looking at the influence on vegetation growth. Or maybe we should actually be looking at sea ice concentration daily across the whole year so that we can get an idea of thresholds in sea ice concentration that will affect the marine ecosystem and productivity differently. And the third thing that we realised was that it was much easier for experts to together describe the effects of those variables on processes, but it was really hard to move from understanding how processes might be affected to really getting that picture. So how will these ecosystems look at 2050 and at 2100? Because there were just so many possibilities. So we worked to reconcile some of these challenges that we had, and we did that in a number of ways. So first of all, we used a scenario approach, and scenarios describe futures that could be rather than futures that will be. And so it allowed a more flexible approach, actually. So a scenario is not a prediction or a forecast, but it describes an alternative path along which the future might unfold. And given the difficulty that was identified with being able to probabilistically predict futures, this approach was a good option for the group. We really wanted a whole Arctic picture. We want to be able to see plausible Arctic ecological futures across the whole Arctic. But we realised that we have to respect the natural ecological boundaries of the systems when trying to understand how things might change in the future. And so we had to break that pan-Arctic scale into, for example, the scale of regional seas and even shelves within regional seas to the scale of herds for caribou, etc. We also found that some of the variables were better than others. So, for example, CMIP6 models didn't reliably resolve precipitation, which was really unfortunate because this variable was identified as seasonally important in many forms. So, for example, rain affects vegetation, rain on snow affects lots of things, including caribou access to winter forage. Snow on ice affects productivity. It also affects the ability of ring seals to build lairs. So yeah, so there were things that worked and things that didn't. And then the last thing that we did was we bracketed the scenarios. So what we did is we had this least change, most change. And so the project team described only the two most extreme scenarios. So the most changed, how the ecosystem would look like under the most change, and then the least change. And so there are only two possibilities, but if you bracket both ends of what's plausible, recognise the actual future state might sit somewhere in between, but at least you've got, you know, the either end of what it could look like. Okay, and we're finally here and we're almost at the end. So to get a little bit more concrete, I wanted to just show you some of the preliminary visioning of a plausible most changed Chukchi Shelf ecosystem and its components under a high emission scenario in 2050. So it's just a summary here, but these are some of the climate variables that were pulled out of the CMIP6 models. And then this is the work of the experts in describing how those climate variables would affect processes related to productivity, species composition and food web, and then what that might actually look like in 2050. And so you can see that there were very good discussions and some summaries on productivity, phytoplankton, zooplankton, species composition including fish, birds, etc., and then how the food web might change as well. Okay, so we found this approach to be useful, the scenario approach. One really important part of it is that you have to keep the narrative together. You can't, if you're developing a whole scenario from one end to the next, you can't be pulling parts out of it and saying, well, this is going to happen. There's sort of a logical hanging together that needs to happen. We found the interdisciplinary approach to be really valuable, and there's a couple of quotes just on the side of the slide there from our experts, and I think they also found it to be valuable. And the last point that I wanted to make is just as we get closer to exceeding 1.5 degrees of warming globally, the urgency, and I think we've heard it in the room all day today, the urgency for that proactive conservation grows. And this proactive conservation planning, whatever shape or way it takes, that planning is critical. And so our next steps are that we would like to continue to vision so that we can add more pieces to the puzzle and actually start to see what the Pan-Arctic might look like at these different time points to help inform policy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really interesting process you guys went through. And I also understand why you have a very big group of people there, of course. So if you have any questions right now, they're very welcome. Yes, please. Just give the microphone a moment. Yeah.
Hi, should I introduce myself or can I just ask a question? Okay, well, my name is Mario Giagnorio and I'm a PhD student from Italy. I study active policy of the European Union, but I'm more interested in your scenario making approach. And I would like just to ask you what's been the results about applying this approach while communicating to politicians, also because scenario making is different from foresight, forecasts. They have different aims, but politicians might prefer some instead of others. So what's your experience in communicating with them about your studies through that kind of approach? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It's a really good one, actually, and we realised that we probably incorrectly named our project Arctic Conservation Forecast and then used a scenario approach, which is not actually forecasting. We haven't got to the communication point yet, but yeah, we understand that scenarios are often used to communicate to policymakers. I think we'll see how we go. I think we need to underscore that, underscore the process, make sure that it's transparent so that people understand what the process was, make sure that we communicate that it had a science basis. That was one of the real aims that we wanted to have. And also with the bracketing, I think that helps to capture some of the uncertainty that we know to be in the system. So I think when we do go to communicate, we'll have to just make sure that we highlight these elements of the scenario approach that might increase comfort in terms of policymakers making decisions. But yeah, it's something that that's our next stage. I think once we actually start to get some plausible futures that we can actually talk about. Thanks.
Thank you. So we do have some 35 minutes left in the session, and so we came up with this brilliant idea to have a panel debate still going on. So we thought of inviting some speakers that we have heard before to the stage. So it would be you, Melanie. Liz Jørgensen would be nice to have as well. Gary will also be on the screen, so please make your way to the stage. And also Christina Dahlaker. So we thought it would be very interesting to put these people in touch with each other in a panel debate because they come from different backgrounds. Obviously, we're having a topic here which is very cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, involving research, involving policy, involving management. So, at least for me as a researcher, I'm quite baffled from what we have all heard today. It was very diverse and it's a lot for me to process. And I thought that would be very dangerous to try to get a panel debate up and running from just the input here. So we've prepared 1 or 2 questions and shared them with the panel debate. And I guess, so my co-moderator Cecilia will help me through this because I'm just a junior researcher on this, so I'm very naive on all of these aspects. So we will also then go and sit here.
We talk. It's easier just to. Okay.
You sit here. So, if I may, my main takeaway from today is that there's a lot of things happening in the different sectors. There's a lot of things happening in research. and there's big problems that we need to answer to. And I hear there's a lot of expertise here, and what I think we're trying to improve here is the communication between all the sectors, and to have scientists feel comfortable going into policy and management, and also the other way around, for example. Please interrupt me if I'm saying absolutely stupid things.
That's fine.
So the first question that I came up with, and that I also shared with the panel members here, is basically how can we improve the directionality of the information flow? Sorry? For the camera? Yeah.
Just because you're not in the shot right now.
Yeah,
All right.
Move you all along a little bit. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So to come back to my super complicated question, what I'm very interested in is we want to have this interface and communication flow between science, policy, and management. I have a feeling, as being a naive junior researcher, that we can improve on how that information is flowing, that it's unclear in which direction it should go, if it's a cyclic pattern, if the initiative should come from the research or if it should be coming from policy, for example. And especially because problems are getting more and more complicated. We have complex issues here, like climate change. So we're also using complex science methodologies, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary methods, system science approaches, where you need a PhD for, basically, to execute them, and maybe even a PhD to interpret them. So that's a big challenge coming from the information flow from science towards policy. And on the other side, policy is also confronted with these issues which need rapid decisions or strong decisions when not all the knowledge might be there. So my question to you, from where I know where your background is, like how do you think is the way forward to improve that interaction between science and policy to get to effective management or effective adaptive management ideally? And I think we'll start at the end of the row.
Oh, no.
And we have one microphone. Apologize for that.
Thank you.
So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. It is a complicated question. I had some thoughts here that I've scribbled down. Yeah. I mean, we have an opportunity here with the Arctic to be proactive, and I think this relates to your question on this need for policy to be in place, even with incomplete science and knowledge and perhaps uncertainty. But nevertheless, yeah, I think we need to act. I mean, I think there's many ways that things can be improved. It was interesting actually this morning, and I don't remember who the speaker was, but we heard from a woman who had a laboratory group, and she was working on qualitative analysis and reading out quotes. Yes, it was you, exactly, yeah, reading out quotes from your lab group about power and powerlessness of scientists, which was really interesting, and I wanted to pick up on that point because I do think there really does need to be empowerment of scientists, actually. I think we need to be working on science-based policy, for one, and I know that scientists need to remain neutral. That's extremely important. But there's nobody quite like scientists who can communicate their own results and provide advice to policymakers. So I do really think that there's room for that empowerment to happen. Civil society organisations like us, like WWF, take on some of that role of translating science into policy or management advice, but we have our own agenda as WWF, so perhaps we're not so neutral sometimes, although we're definitely science-based. So yeah, I would say that would be one way, is definitely to empower scientists either through institutions, having institutions that take that advice and translate it, making things like summaries for policymakers is one very small step, I think, but an important one.
That's really difficult to follow, but again, just to reintroduce myself, I'm Christine Dolliker, and I'm part of the Norwegian Center for the Law of the Sea here in Tromsø. So that is, and again, for those who didn't participate in the earlier session, and I'm coming from the legal perspective, I'm a lawyer, and so I'm coming from the governance perspective. And so what my presentation, I was saying that you cannot have adaptive management and a complete implementation of the ecosystem approach without adaptive governance. So that was the crux of my argument. So I'm coming at it from the perspective, and I really support Gary's view of this triangle as I saw it, with the ecosystem, policy, and governance, and interconnectedness, around that triangle. So I very much support the view that we do need more interdisciplinary communication. I think the Arctic Frontiers is that perfect opportunity to do that. And then I've also had the privilege of working with my fellow panelist here, and Raoul, who is also sitting in the room. And really, if you do have the opportunity to participate in an interdisciplinary research project, I think we all gained so much from it because we realized we weren't even speaking the same language. And this is really where encouraged some of my thinking about the fact that, management and governance are two very different things, and they're seen by natural scientists as maybe sometimes confusedly as one thing. So I think it's if you keep on asking those questions of your interdisciplinary team, I think there's a lot that can come from that. Multilateral negotiations of various fora is another opportunity where natural scientists and policymakers and legal scientists that's the place where we can really come together and come up with some recommendations and hopefully inspire and inform some of these negotiations as they come together. I've been very involved in the BB&J negotiations, and again, the science is going to be really guiding and driving this agreement, and we've needed the scientists there every step of the way. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. I think we'll wait for Gary as the last one. Yeah.
Come on.
Please go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, so I was chewing a little bit on your question. It was very long. It was 10 questions in one question. So I decided that I would try to do a little bit simple. And I actually would like to start with something that Raoul said in his talk, that interaction between stressors are likely to be a major source to surprises for management. And I think that's an important message. Do we really know what will happen out there? Are we so damn secure that this and this would happen and that we shall do this and that? I'm not really sure. And I also saw from our speaker behind here, or he said something that there's a disconnection between the speed of environmental change and the speed of the management decisions and goals and actions. So how do we manage? How do we go from here to there? So how do we prepare for a future like that? And in the very beginning, we have some Greenland talks. They talked about a bottom-up driven long-term monitoring. And I think that's a pretty good key issue here, that if we should be prepared for the unknown and what we do not know what is, surprise out there, we have to be prepared in a very, very broad sense. So we should not cultivate the specific, the narrow things. We should cultivate the broad things. So that will be my direction, both to policymakers, to those who are distributing the money for science, that don't make it too narrow. Cultivate the broad. Cultivate the biodiversity, because the diversity will make it resilient. Not that we specify too much. So I think it is extremely important that we continue our long-term monitoring series that we have on our institution, both governmental and also other institutions. and keep on there and maintaining these types of approaches and continue our science, at least knowing what is happening. And then when we do that on a broad scale, we can go with what surprises will pop up wheresoever, geographically or in the ecosystem. So I think that should be the major focus on the future, and that is the broad one.
Gary.
And Gary, are you still with us?
Yeah. So I'm just having a look at myself, like the horror movie from big bald head overlooking. Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say, but I also want to say that we also have Cecilia sitting there on the end, and I've had the great privilege of working with her in the last couple of years and on our Antarctic issues. And I don't know whether she wants to jump in and say some things, because she certainly has some very valid viewpoints on this. But the first thing I'd like to say, just I think, is following on also from those wonderful other presentations, is that communication is, to my point, in my view, is the key. And one way, I think Cecilia may comment on this, that we found very effectively is to use the power of the Shiny app, the power of getting decision makers and scientists in a room together and interactively showing them what these potential scenarios are. So following on from that wonderful work by WWF, that would be an example of that, where you gather all the people in the room as they have done, but you put it in a Shiny app and you let the policy people play with those scenarios. Because one thing, and again, Cecilia may comment on this, that we have found at sort of the more delegation level, at an international level, is the ability, many of the policy people and governance people are overloaded with work, have huge commitments. It's very difficult for them to take in our complexity from the science. But what we have to do is distill the information down while maintaining the inherent strength of the science, but allow them in their own time and in their own space to play with that information and then see what they can. And we found that a very effective way to change perspective and a very effective way for them to come back and ask the questions that they want from the science. So that may be one point. The second point I want to say, and again, it may be a bit controversial, is I think it's very important as we move forward that scientists stay being scientists. The credibility, we have to be very clear that we don't step into policy decisions. And I've been very privileged because Cecilia acts as our gateway to policy. I present the science. She then is the gateway to the policy with an understanding of the political process. And that's also an effective way to speed up the disconnect between the scientific information and policy decision. And the other last comment I'd maybe like to make, and then pass it back to the panel, is that often in this, we are speaking to our people with a similar view to ourselves, and they're not the ones we have to convince. And so while this may be difficult for us, some of us to stomach, we actually have to focus on the people that do not agree, obviously, and come up with the science to persuade them. And maybe actually, having said that, there may be one last point I'm going to say, and that is how we deal with the complexity. Now, while we've seen in all those presentations, those two presentations previously, I would actually argue that they can be distilled down to quite simple messages. But part of the message and part of the something we have seen in our own work is you also have to include the good messages. There are things that are going to be of benefit from climate change in the Arctic, whether we agree or not. And that has to be part of a balanced picture. So yeah, I'll go back to the panel.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. You mentioned, you can't see me, trying to catch your size. So we are talking about complexity, and I think that we should keep that in mind nature is not simple. Nature is extremely complex. And we are talking about causal systems, interaction. We cannot really predict what is happening. I mean, just look at the weather forecast, how much prediction or prognosis that we have from there. So keeping that in mind, and when we come with our shiny apps, that should be very easy to read and look at, and also a little bit delicate and nice to work with. Always remember what type of work that lies behind. I love the work of the meteorological institutes. They convert a tremendous amount of data every day into this simple map of where you see an umbrella and a cloud with some rain and stuff like that. And I really like that. But remember, they can predict 3 days out in future, and they have a system, a weather forecast system that is way beyond what we have within our science. So having this little bit back-leaned, knowing, well, we have a future out there that we cannot control, and probably we don't understand to see everything. So also that balance, I think we should be awake for.
Yeah, can I maybe just say, I totally agree with you. I think what I was probably wanting to say too is that when you look at that work from the WWF, what I really like about it is that they're talking about scenarios rather than prediction. And I think that's something as well that we should be aiming for, is to get away from prediction, as you quite rightly say, on the complexity. And what we are presenting to policy and governance is scenarios, because then that allows the consensus decision-making to move forward. The moment we present a prediction, as you quite rightly say, people go, well, have a look at the weather, have a look at climate, have a look at what the Met Service does, and so on. So, yeah. I would aim for scenarios. Absolutely.
And we also have, and want to, of course, know what type of audience do we have, what type of expertise do we have present at the moment. And we have a certain way of doing that, which will be introduced from Igor.
We thought it would be nice because it's been a long day and things should remain fun, absolutely. So we have this little interactive presentation that you can also participate in and play with. So if you're still awake enough and you're interested, it would be very nice if you can participate in this presentation. So the way it works is you either go to the website and enter that code there, or like I can see a lot of people, you use your phone camera. It should give you the link instantly when you point at the QR code.
Do you need us to do this?
No.
Everyone can join, absolutely, yeah. A lot of love going around here. So I give it another 20 seconds and then we'll get going with the presentation. Does it work, eh?
Yeah.
There's a lot of love. A lot of love in the room.
That's good. That's what we need.
So it's loading.
Okay. So you can still jump in at any point anyway, but let's see if this is gonna work. Yes. So basically we have a lot of expertise and diversity in the room here, and I thought it would be a shame to not at least capture that for this unique moment, I think. I'm really excited about this session. So, some questions. Please state your business here. Oh. At least we have a science session. That's great. So I don't know what you're wondering, but the 15% of other, I kind of like to know who you are. Okay. So, but you're not 15%, so who's the other 14%? Yeah. Do you want to say where you are, if those other, the people who chose other? Yeah?
Research Council, Science Founders.
Yep.
Yeah,
For example.
Yeah. It's just good to know for everyone in the room as well, because a lot of people will think there's science and there's policy, but of course, there's a lot of places to work at these days. So let's go on and see how involved are you in the science policy interactions. And so you should see on your screen that you have 5 options to click. So basically one going from not at all to number 5 on a daily basis, but you should be able to choose 2, 3, and 4 as well. And for this being pretty much a very much science-dominated audience, I think that's quite impressive to see this coming to, because basically option 3 was like, well, it's a reality of my job, it's a reality of my profession. I am doing these interactions. So that's really encouraging to see. Let's see what the next one is. So this is I should have put a copyright on this, but I took it from a paper. Basically, it's the cycle of knowledge creation, and it suggests those 4 quadrants. And it's very nicely explained of how the interlinkages would be between science policy, creation of science at the bottom, integration of science and results at the top. So where do you identify with being in this quadrant? So again, that makes total sense when a lot of our researchers here that we're trying to fill those knowledge gaps, which we have heard so many times today, that identifying knowledge gaps is also very important, actually. So while we see in the right bottom quarter, this is very important for us to find ways to communicate with each other, to find the topics to address, right?
And what we have seen, at least that has been working quite a bit on this, is that sometimes at least we hear from the scientists that one of the main problems is that they really don't know exactly what the management needs. And I think those working in management, they do communicate that, or they think they do it, but somewhere on the way something happens. So even though we do talk to each other, we still have difficulties in actually getting the message through. And how to deal with that is a challenge. So, and clearly here as well, it would be much better if it was possible to have a little bit more. Those who fill the gaps should also be identifying what's the most urgent needs, perhaps at least to a bigger degree, and that we see here.
Yeah, 13% is not too much.
No.
So we anticipated this a little bit. Hence, we came up with that question. How do we improve that interaction between science and policy, which is obviously pivoted around these knowledge gaps, right? We present knowledge gaps as researchers. Policymakers, they say there are knowledge gaps, and then somehow these are 2 parallel universes. So how do we improve this communication? So the first question what is your personal opinion of if we're doing a really good job or not, or if what I'm telling you is my personal opinion, of course, that I think there could be better science policy integration. So, but what does the room think? I think option 2 was called baby steps. And number 3 was, I can't remember. We're getting there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of, I guess, vacancies for positions that should be out there to actually make sure that integration works much better. So then the next 2 slides basically are some of our ideas, basically. So this slide and the next one is how to find solutions forward, because that's essentially what we would like to do, right? We want to have a fulfilling job, we want to have fun going forward as a society. So how do we actually improve the integration between science and policy? So here you can vote for several options if you want. And if one of those terms are not clear, just please have a shout out and say, what the hell does that mean, or what do you mean with that? So, keeping in mind the third option would be Arctic frontiers. So.
Is it possible to suggest that assessment could have been one of the alternatives?
You know, so I'm not so good with that thing that I did last evening. So, but I'm gonna make a mental note of it. That I think that's what I meant with the groups and bodies, basically, because they make this integrated assessments. I would put it underneath that category. But I very much agree with what you mean. Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, within each of these categories, there will be a lot of sub-units, so to speak. So it's just the general thoughts we are looking for. And based on this, hopefully, since at least the 2 first ones are coming quite high out, and we know there are lots of working groups, there are lots of bodies already. So at least we are somewhat on the right track, I would say. If it would be worse if we had just on others as a big one, for example. That being said, of course, there are room for improvements, but we are on the right track, perhaps, based on this.
It does look like there's maybe space for some new groups. For example, just the idea that Gary proposed that we should have a triage expert group, for example, so more of the integration of knowledge. I think that's maybe meant why everyone goes for this first one. So this is about one aspect to do it, but how about, what do you think about these things? So this is more concrete, tangible tools that we could invest in or try to include in our everyday work or in new projects, for example. And again, what I always think is the very interesting category is others. So it would be very interesting to hear from you what you came up with, what would be that other thing to do, actually. So if you feel to share with the room, it would be very nice to hear it. And otherwise, you can tell me afterwards at a coffee as well. No problem. Yeah. Yes? Oh. Could you say it with the microphone, because I even can't hear it?
Sorry, maybe I pick up other, and I think involving people who are living here, not only the stakeholders, but also the citizens
Local.
and so on.
Yeah, local population, yeah. Right, I don't think much is changing there, so...
Nope.
Oh, yeah. It's a tight, that's very tight. Yeah, it's also what I had from my distillation from what we heard today, that we like to see this interactive mapping tools, visualization tools. Things are becoming complex, but we are very good as a visual species to investigate trends and so on. So.
But a couple of thoughts then. When you have, now we have heard so many options, so many ways of doing things. I think everyone agrees that communication is important. Personally, I would also like to add perhaps respect for each other, respect that not everyone thinks and means and have the same opinion that I have, and how then to still be able to move forward, which means not everyone can get what they want. But the challenging thing is there is a lot of research going on not just on the basic level of the science, but also how to work together, how to do ecosystem-based or ecosystem approach to management. But somewhere here we still need to make decisions. We still need to manage the system. So do you think, someone here, that we may risk overloading with options? So perhaps it gets difficult to make decisions. I'm just asking. You're actually running out of time here as well.
I think what you said.
Can we turn on the microphone?
Yeah?
Yeah. Perfect.
I think what you said there, Cecile, is really important, is that societal visioning of what we want it to be and accepting that, going for something, accepting that not everybody, it can't be everything that everybody wants it to be. And then that's really important to, I think, avoid that, too many options, or, if you're on a common pathway that is agreed and decided, by society, then that learning, adapting, adjusting, all of these things we've heard about today, adaptive governance, adaptive management. I think all of that, maybe you can avoid too many options and too many decisions if you have that common line that you're trying to keep, I think. I don't know, maybe it's a little bit idealistic, but I think it's really important. And in everything, in the, these long-term monitoring studies that we're learning about, the knowledge that's gathered, things being done on the right scale to be able to inform and then make decisions and adapt. It's having that common goal at the beginning then helps to kind of inform everything afterwards.
I find that a very inspiring end of the session, actually. So I've really truly found this a very interesting experience to get this session together, get all the different opinions, and still, although different opinions, there is this touching surfaces, or how you say this in English, which seems like we're all working on the same thing. In the end, we want the same thing. So I think that's a very nice message, and that we will get there as long as we talk to each other and get things done. So with that, I would like to close the session. We're also 2 minutes late. I do want to take the opportunity to really thank you for your presence here. This is really amazing. Thank you so much. And I also want to point out we have a poster session this evening, which should not be forgotten. And in 27 minutes and 36 seconds, there will be another very interesting session here in the same room, which is actually on adaptive risk management, if I get it right. Yeah. So definitely come to that as well. It's going to be a very nice follow-up and a more specialization into what we had here today. So thanks again for coming, and have a nice afternoon still.